So, welcome to a new video. Today we are looking at installing pistons and rods, or basically putting them together and putting in some bearings into both of them. There are some important things to note, and that's why I'm doing this video. It might not be the most interesting topic, or might be a very basic topic, but still there are some important things to cover. The first thing I'm doing here is cleaning all the surfaces. This is very important. Make sure that all your engine parts are as clean as possible, so there's no debris or anything. If there's, for example, a piece of sand or dirt or debris or whatever in there, that might distort the bearings to a point where the clearances are so tight that nothing will turn anymore. So that's important to do that first. Before I insert the bearings into the rod or into the rod cap or wherever, this applies the same for anything else like main bearings, etc. I put a bit of oil onto the rod itself because due to the surface tension of the oil, any dirt or debris that is left over gets pushed out with the oil itself, and therefore there won't be anything left in there. You might say, well, but the bearing can slip then if it is oiled up. Well, no, because there are locating tabs that locate the bearing in place and it will not rotate, at least not if the engine is not malfunctioning or if you don't have any other engine issues like oil pressure problems. Because those tabs that locate the bearings, obviously they can also get damaged if you have no oil pressure in the engine. But for example, when assembling right now and putting in assembly lube later or oil later to give the car a first lubrication before the engine starts, it is not going to be a problem. One thing that is also very important is that you remember from when you take out your parts, or rather if you put in, for example, some forged rods, that you remember the orientation of the rod caps to the rod itself, how they go, and do not mix and match up those caps and rods, because they might be machined to different tolerances, or they might be machined differently in general. Or for example, if you have a cracked rod, which is something very different, so the rod is basically cast and then there is a casting line basically that is a weak point in the rod, and at that line where the rod and the rod cap meet, the rod is cracked there so that the stress in the material is relieved, and so the line where both ends meet is not straight and therefore has to match from rod to rod, and also on the orientation even more. That's even more important in that case. But still, on normal rods, that's also very important, because otherwise the bearing tolerances might not match. I'm just putting in all of the bearings now so that we can weigh the rods and the pistons, so that we can balance everything, or rather so that we can choose what rods we are putting on what pistons, because that is also important. You might not have much of a difference in custom pieces, like for example in forged pistons and forged rods. Those usually are only within 1 gram of each other, but with stock parts they can vary by 3 to 5 grams. That is kind of the usual case, and then you might want to pair the lightest rod with the heaviest piston, for example, and the other way around. That's what I'm doing here. I'm weighing the rods and the pistons, or rather in this case only the pistons, because I already weighed the rods and put them in the correct spots. And then I'm putting the, as I said, heaviest piston to the lightest rod, and lightest piston to the heaviest rod. This might not make much of a difference, but trust me, even a few grams count here. The engine will run smoother that way, although you might not really feel it. The next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to install the rods on the pistons. This is also pretty easy, but the hardest part is getting the clips for the piston gudgeon pins in there. So you don't really see me doing much here because I wasn't able to film that with a good camera angle, but I was just pushing in the pin on one side until it slightly came through. Then I put in the rod and pushed the gudgeon pin the rest of the way through. I used assembly lube for assembling this. You can also use engine oil. That's not that big of a deal. That's also not a problem. I would suggest using as thick of an oil as possible, so like 10W60 or something, so that the oil stays on the parts as long as possible. Because if you, for example, let the engine sit a while, then that oil won't drain from these parts. And that's why I like to use assembly oil, because that exactly does that. You can put an engine in the corner for months on end, and assembly lube, it will not drip down, it will stay on those components much longer than normal oil. Being finished with the install of the pistons on the rods, I had the fun task of installing the circlips for the pistons, which can be quite frustrating. I have now found a technique where that makes it a lot easier. So you basically put in the clip in the groove on the left side and use a pick to press it into the right side. It doesn't really hurt anything if you use a pick, because that surface of the piston isn't really touching anywhere. So if you scratch it lightly, that doesn't make a difference. And although it may not look the best, it's not an issue for later installation and later running. But that is just one of those things that is kind of difficult in building an engine, because those clips can also fly away and never to be seen again. And I had the fun of that in the past as well, but now I know what to do and how to avoid that. Just put your thumb over the clip while you are trying it, so that it doesn't fly through the room. That's basically it. Again, it's only being careful, looking at orientations, and making the work or working as cleanly as possible, and also just lube up everything as well as possible. See you in the next video. Until then, have a nice day. Goodbye.